Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has ordered to halt the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, Putin has rejected Trump's offer to end the war. Meanwhile, Kremlin considers changing its military objectives in Ukraine. So why does Putin announce so-called three-day ceasefire in Ukraine, and why is Kremlin forced to change its military aims in Ukraine? Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has announced temporary ceasefire in Ukraine from May 8 to May 11 to mark the end of the World War II. Ukraine's foreign minister Andriy Sybiha called for an immediate ceasefire lasting at least 30 days, not 3 days. He questioned this decision and said, quote, "Why wouldn't Putin ceasefire for at least 30 days?" Putin was also criticized by the White House. It seems like Vladimir Putin is using 3-day ceasefire to prevent Trump from abandoning ceasefire talks. As we know, after the meeting with President Zelensky, Trump published a post criticizing Putin for recent missile attacks on Ukraine. Quote, "It makes me think that maybe Putin doesn't want to stop the war, he's just tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently throughout banking or secondary sanctions. Too many people are dying." Meanwhile, Russian dictator Putin has rejected Trump's ceasefire offer. He's still insisting that Russia must take control over 4 regions of Ukraine if it doesn't fully occupy as a part of an agreement to end the war, according to CNN sources. It seems to be a big blow to US President Trump's effort to reach a ceasefire deal. Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff tried to persuade Putin that Russia should agree to a ceasefire that holds fighting along the current front lines during talks in Kremlin. Instead, Russian dictator maintained his maximalist position on territory. He rejected this offer. Negotiations have reached a stalemate, and now it requires a direct contract between Putin and Trump to make progress. Ukrainian President Zelensky posted on X that his country was preparing for talks with the US on new sanctions. Quote, "We are identifying precisely those pressure points that will most directly push Moscow toward diplomacy." Also, new intelligence reviewed by US and Western officials suggests that Putin may have shifted his focus in Ukraine war towards the short-term objective of solidifying his hold on territory and boosting his country's economy, according to CNN. As CNN reports, the perception Putin may have shifted his thinking has played into President Trump's and his negotiations' beliefs that President Trump may be willing to consider a potential ceasefire deal. However, senior US officials remain skeptical of Putin and his assertions in ongoing talks that he wants a peace deal, even though what is being proposed by the US is generous to Russia, handing them most of the territories they have taken. Also, there is a belief that even if Russia agrees to ceasefire deal, it may look to resume the war and try to seize more of Ukraine in the long-term perspective. Additionally, the pressure exerted by an increasingly angry Trump's administration threatening more sanctions and struggling Russian economy have put Putin in difficult position right now. Moscow is willing to play along with the US and restrict its immediate objectives to improve its relationship with the US, European officials said, but clearly hasn't given up on their maximalist war aims. The Kremlin hopes that a better relationship draws the attention away from a tactical pause and that they can use a mix of military, economic and informational tools to achieve Putin's full objectives in Ukraine and beyond. Earlier this year, US intelligence official cautious now senior Trump's advisors that controlling Ukraine remained Putin's top maximalist demand next to regime survival and warned he was eager to exploit any perceived rush to negotiations by the new administration, according to sources familiar with those conversations. However, US President Donald Trump has changed his rhetoric on Russian dictator Putin after months of private diplomatic efforts by British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron, according to Politico. According to publication, Trump's change of course was a result of long-term coordination between London, Paris and Washington. Starmer and Macron sought to persuade the US president to reduce pressure on Zelensky and direct some of his anger on Putin, using the argument that Putin is making a fool of Trump. The publication reports that the key role in negotiations with the American administration was played by UK National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell and Defense Secretary John Healey. Their efforts were coordinated with the US ambassador to the UK, Mark Burnett. For his part, British Foreign Secretary David Lammy said he had 13 conversations with US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Starmer and Trump this year alone talked almost as many as 13 times. Also, Britain and France, he said, had repeatedly stressed that Putin was disrespectful by repeatedly breaking the ceasefire that he himself had declared. Trump has realized that Putin cannot be trusted. This is what President Macron is constantly repeating and trying to convey to Trump. However, Ukraine and France are now forced to wait anxiously to see whether the US President's tougher stance on Putin will withstand for a while, according to Politico. Also, Stephen Pfeiffer, a senior fellow at the American think tank Brookings Institution, also noticed that Trump had a blind spot regarding Putin and who ignored the US request. Also, for the first time, Trump's administration informed Congress of its intention to greenlight export of defense products to Ukraine through direct commercial sales of $50 million or more, as Kyiv Post reported. The permission, the first of this kind since Trump's return to the White House over 100 days ago, comes just a week after the Trump's administration paused Ukraine aid and all military aid to Ukraine, leveraging US influence to end the war in Ukraine rather than use the diplomacy. Also, Congress, in its last aid package for Ukraine, had approved over $1 billion worth of arms for Ukraine under the previous Biden administration. The $50 million sale license notice, first seen by the Kyiv Post and was submitted to Congress via the Arms Export Control Act, a law that authorizes US President to control the import and export of defense articles and services, according to formal notice sent to the Congress from the State Department. Meanwhile, the US State Department says that the United States will change its approach to efforts to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine and plans to take a less active role, according to the State Department spokeswoman Tammy Bruce. Tammy Bruce replies that Trump seeks to act primarily through diplomacy and also knows that there are more parts of the world and the whole world needs to be given some attention. She recalls the words of Secretary of State Rubio that US plans to change its approach to its attempts to bring the end of the Russian-Ukrainian war closer. Quote, "But we are not going to fly around the world as the first call and be a mediator of meetings. This is now between the two sides, and now this is the time for them to be present and develop concrete ideas on how to end this war. This will be their task." Also, US Vice President J.D. Vance does not believe that Russia's war against Ukraine can end in the near future. US would continue its efforts to reach a deal, he said that in the interview with Fox News. Vance noted that the US administration is now faced with the question of how to help Russia and Ukraine find a compromise to end the war that has been going on for more than 3 years. However, according to him, it is Russia and Ukraine that must come to an agreement and stop the war. This will not end in the near future, however, Vance noted. At the same time, US Vice President expressed optimism about the prospect for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.